So now we're going to discuss the pelvic limb, and then we'll also do the visceral skeleton in this presentation too. The pelvic limb is directly connected to the axial skeleton between the pelvis and the sacrum of the vertebral spine at a place called the sacroiliac joint. And this joint is made up of fibrocartilage that holds these two bones together in attachment. Looking at the limbs of the pelvic limb, we do start off with the pelvis. There's four distinct areas of the pelvis. There is the ilium, the ischium, the pubis, and the acetabulum. Going distally from there, we have the femur, and so where the femur and the pelvis meets, that's the hip joint. From the femur, we go down to the tibia and the fibula, and we have groups of sesamoid bones right at that location. And so where the femur meets with the tibia and the fibula, that is the stifle. In the human, it's called the knee. We are starting to also call it the knee in dogs and cats in a lot of journals and papers. We have two groups of sesamoid bones in dogs and cats, the patella, which is known as your kneecap, and that's going to be on the dorsal surface of the joint or the cranial. And then you also have in dogs and cats on the caudal surface the fibullae, which is actually lacking in large animals like horses and cattle. The tibia and the fibula go down and meet the tarsus or the hock joint. And so there we have the tarsal bones. And then we have from the tarsal bones, we have metatarsal bones, which would run down to the digits and the phalanges. And really there's not much difference between the metatarsal bones and metacarpal bones as far as the way they look or in the functions they do. The same thing with the phalanges. It's just the fact that we're no longer on the front limb, and so instead of calling them a metacarpal bone, we now call them a metatarsal bone. So looking at the pelvis is actually formed by three bones that will eventually fuse into one bone, and we actually do have the pelvis, so there's actually truly 6 bones here. So each ilium develops embryologically as its own bone. Each pubis does the same thing, and so does each ischium. Where they all come together, they make the acetabulum, which is the socket side of the hip for the ball and socket joint. We have a right half and a left half of the pelvis. So right here looking at this pelvis, this would be actually the left half. This is the right half. Where they meet down the center is the pubic symphysis. Some people also call it the pelvis symphysis. But it's down here on the floor of the birth canal. When we look at the ilium, it does come up here into what we call the ilium wing. It's also known as the tuber coxae. And so this wing of the ilium, a lot of people will call this the hook bone, and this is a landmark we can easily feel on the outside of an animal. So if we're trying to figure out where the abdomen ends and the pelvis begins, we can feel it. When we're doing radiographs, we will actually feel for this bone if we're trying to get the hip in it, because we know where the cranial margin is. And then down here on the caudal margin, we have the tibia or ischial tuberosity. And so the ischial tuberosity is also known as the pin bone, and we feel this. We know we're at the caudal margin of the pelvis. We know we can feel these two if we're doing radiographs. If we shoot somewhere in the center, we will have the center of the pelvis. In the middle of the pelvis, there is this obturator foramen right here, and this is a location where nerves and blood vessels actually pass through the pelvis and down into the limb. And once again, the acetabulum, this is the socket part of the hip for the ball and socket joint. So this is where the femur is actually going to attach and match up to the pelvis. The femur makes up the area we know as the thigh, and it is the thigh bone. The head of the femur right here actually fits right into the acetabulum. There's actually a ligament that goes between the head of the femur and into the acetabulum. There's also blood vessels that will nerves that can actually pass between the two along with that ligament. So there's a nutrient foramen right here. And then off to the side, we have on the lateral side the greater trochanter, and this is where all the muscles that move the hip and also help to move the stifle or knee are going to be located and attached to this greater trochanter. There is a space here between the head of the femur and the greater trochanter. Unlike on the humerus where there is no space between the head and the greater tubercle, you can easily fit a finger in between here. Coming down, we have the shaft or the diaphysis, and then distally we have the trochlear groove, which would actually be where the stifle's at. And so the patella actually sits up here in the trochlear groove, actually the trochlea, and actually sits here and articulates back and forth. So we have the trochlear ridges. The whole thing is the trochlea itself. Ridges are on the side, and then the ligaments in the patella ride right here in the groove of the trochlea. And then we also have condyles. So we have the medial and lateral condyles of the femur, and then we also have epicondyles on the side of them. There are two groups of sesamoid bones that can be associated with the stifle and with the femur. The first is the patella. This is going to be in all animals. So this is a very large sesamoid bone. It forms at the distal end of the tendons of the quadriceps femoris muscle. And so this patella actually helps to protect the tendons as they move over top of the stifle. And then they actually give leverage for extending the stifle joint and actually locking the stifle joint or knee in place. The patella is going to be located on the cranial side of the stifle joint. The fibrillae are going to be located on the caudal side of the joint. These actually are a pair, so they're two small sesamoid bones. They're in the proximal gastrocnemius muscles of dogs and cats. The big job they do is actually in assisting in flexion of the stifle. And they are not present in our large animals, so like cattle and horses. On the distal side of the stifle joint is going to be the tibia, and this is the main weight-bearing bone of the shin region. It's going to extend from the femur down to the tarsus. So proximally it's going to meet the stifle, and distally it's going to meet the tarsus. There is an area that we call the tibial tuberosity. It's underneath this patella. It's kind of a triangular shaped area right below the stifle joint and right below the femur. And then it actually has a raised piece of bone that comes down that's known as the tibial crest. And this is what most people feel is their shin bone. It's the very hard bone right below the stifle or knee joint. Distally, we have the medial malleolus, and so this would be the bump on the inside of your ankle that you feel. The fibula is the very small bone that runs parallel and on the lateral surface of the tibia. This one is not weight-bearing. The main job and function of the fibrillae is actually for muscles to attach to help operate the digits. It does have a projection on the distal end known as the lateral malleolus. And when we get into our large animals, horses have a very small rudimentary fibula that does not actually extend all the way down to the distal end, so they only have a tibia at the distal end. And cattle have just a bare small notch right here of where there was a fibula. So when we get to our large animals, they don't actually have one that actually goes all the way down, and cattle really truly lack one altogether. Horses just have a very small rudimentary one that probably only goes not even quite a quarter of a way down parallel to the tibia. When we get to the tarsus, there are 3 rows of bones, and so we start off here with what they're calling the tibial tarsal bone, which is actually properly called the talus. So the talus is actually the part that's going to articulate and move with the tibia. And then what they're calling the fibular tarsal bone is actually known as the calcaneus. So properly this is the calcaneus. Same thing as your heel bone. And so this bone right here really is just a lever to allow flexion, lifting of the toes, and actually flexion of the digits, and allow the foot to be moved. We then have 2 rows of bones below the calcaneus and the talus. And so in the horse we have actually 1 bone here that's the central tarsal. Right here underneath these we actually have the true, there should be a tibial, a central, and a fibular tarsal bone, which would actually be below the talus and calcaneus. In the horse we just have 1 big one called the central tarsal bone, and usually that's the one we look at because it's the most simplified to look at. And then distally we have the distal row of bones, and they're going to be numbered 1 through 4 in the horse. So starting medially you're going to have bone number 1, and then all the way the most lateral being bone number 4. When we get to the metatarsal bones, these are going to be the same as the metacarpal bones as far as their look, functions, and everything. It's just important to know that we're going to actually number them 2 through 5 since there are no osseous dew claws naturally in the back of dogs and cats. And so 2 through 5 is the way that we actually number them. In the horse, there's one big central metatarsal bone, which is the third metatarsal, with the 2 splint bones, which would be metatarsal 2 and 4. Finally, when we get to the phalanges, they're going to be exactly the same as you're going to see on the thoracic limb, minus the dew claw. And so all of these are going to have a metatarsal bone that's going to meet with a phalangeal bone here, and you're going to have 3 phalangeal bones, so P1, P2, P3 on all of these. So all of these bones right here, and these are kind of bent to where they're hard to see on the cat, but on the dog you can easily see. On this one here, I've got a P1, a P2, and a P3. Same thing here, P1, P2, P3, and so on. And they're going to be numbered. Actually, the most medial right here is going to be digit number 2 to digit number 5. Since they don't have a dew claw, they don't have a number 1. They just have 2 through 5. Lastly, we'll look at the visceral skeleton. So these are bones that are actually not hooked up to any other bones. And they're going to be found in soft organs. And there's 3 major visceral bones that we find. The first one is the os cordis. This is going to be found in the heart of the cow and the sheep. And so it's right in the ventricular septum there. Don't know why they actually have a bone in ruminants like that in the middle of their heart that skeletal muscle attaches to. No other species actually has that domestically that we deal with, nor do humans. But we do have that in our cattle and in our sheep. The os penis bone, and that's what this picture here is actually from a canine os penis bone, where we actually have the tip or the apex, we have the base, and then there's actually a urethral groove that the urethra goes through, so the base would be near the body, and then the apex would be near the glands of the penis. And so we find that in the canine and the dog, raccoons, beavers, and walruses. Lastly, we have the os rostri, and this is going to be found in swine. And so pigs actually have this in their nose, and it actually helps them with rooting. So they actually have this hard bony plate in there that helps them to root dirt up out of the ground when they're trying to find food. So that is an overview of the pelvic limb and the visceral skeleton. Next we will move on to joints.